Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good morning. My name is Lance French. I'm the Director of Marketing for W&M Environmental, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on tips for accurate reporting. Where our expert today is W&M's Nick Foreman. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. But before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, send them to us through the chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't have time to get to your questions, there is a lot of information in the webinar today. If we don't get to it, we'll make sure that Nick sees it and we'll get you an answer as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website very soon, along with the slides. And I will email you a link when they're made available. So let's get to it. So we're in Dallas today and it's cold and it's rainy and it's dreary. We should be on the couch under a blanket watching movies with popcorn. But we got the next best thing. We are going to be on a webinar of tips on accurate reporting, environmental reporting. So, Nick, let's get started.
Sure.
So, tell us a little about yourself.
So again, my name is Nick Foreman. I've been with W&M for about almost 12 years, and I've progressed over the years. And I started as a environmental scientist way back in the day, and I've progressed all the way to division manager.
And that's been newly appointed division manager.
Newly appointed.
Congratulations.
I'm still in the holy cow, what's going on type phase, but I'm learning.
Yeah, we know that. We saw.
Thanks, Lance.
But you're a BS in biology from A&M, and is that a master's of public health?
Yes.
You're a master of public health. I couldn't.
I'm a master of public health.
You're a master of public
yes.
health. Okay, excellent. So you've been with W&M for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you should know what you're doing on environmental reporting.
Yeah, I have a pretty darn good hold of it all.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, let's get started to your agenda.
All right. So, like we mentioned in the little teaser here, this is this is designed to be a very high level training to go over what all you can do to help yourself prepare to be successful for reporting with these various programs. We'll talk about the due dates or for each of these reports, and then we'll go through kind of report by report in chronological order, and we'll talk about what things you can do to make yourself successful and make it as painless as possible. Unfortunately, there's no way to get through reporting season without a little bit of pain, but we'll do what we can to help you along the way and rip it off like a Band-Aid. So. All right, the first things to know here, we've broken this down into like 6 tips, and you'll see them over and over and over again on this slides, but we really want to ingrain them in you. The first thing is don't be late, know your date. So at W&M here, we have an industrial compliance team of, I think it's probably 15 strong now, something along those lines. And we affectionately refer to this time period between January 1st and July 1st as reporting season. We don't take a whole lot of PTO during this season. We all work a whole lot of hours during the season, but we know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel come July 2nd. We can all take a little bit of a breath and all that kind of stuff. So with that being said, the first real thing to do is start early. Go ahead and know that your first report is due March 1st. Actually, your first 2 reports are due March 1st. Your annual waste summary and your tier 2 are due on March 1st, assuming that you fulfill the annual waste summary on the steers, which most everyone does now.
You have about a week before it's due.
Yes, right now you have about a week. So you're probably pushing the limits on what you can and can't get done on the first ones, but hopefully you've already started that.
Can you get them done in a week?
Depending on the site, you can. Okay. We can, not always, but that is something that if you come to us and, depending on your facility and depending on the information that you have available, we can definitely work with you.
So hopefully our listeners out there have at least started. And if they haven't, what do you suggest? Besides maybe praying and crying. Maybe.
Well, no. I mean, the best thing is get a team together and wrap your brain around what needs to be done, and we'll go over kind of what the ultimate goal of all of these is whenever you start doing your research and stuff like that. So, but my first piece of advice would be to put a tickler on your calendar for next year on January 1st or 2nd, whenever you come back from the holidays, and say start working on your annual waste summary and your tier 2 reports. So that gets us through March 1st. On March 31st, there are 2 more reports. So you get a little bit of a break there between March 1st and March 31st. And then you have your benchmark or your stormwater benchmark and DMR reports. And then you also have your area emission inventory reports, all due March 31st. And then after March 1st, you can do a little type exercise and decompress for a couple days to a week, and then you dive right back into TRIs and pollution prevention annual progress reports. So jumping right into it, and like Lance said, feel free to ask questions on the webinar software. But this is going to be a lot of material, so we may not get to your questions. But feel free to ask them. We'll have either me, myself, or someone here on the team. We'll get through the questions and we'll get you an answer as quick as we can. So for an annual waste summary, the first thing to do is determine if you have to report. So there's a lot of times that you don't have to report, or a lot of facilities don't have to report. It depends on the amount and the quantity and the type of waste that you're generating. So if you're a small or large quantity generator, you're going to have to report. If you generated greater than 2,000 pounds of Class 1 non-hazardous waste, or you stored greater than or equal to 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste, or greater than 2.2 pounds of acutely hazardous waste, you're going to have to report. Now, there's such thing as a no report required annual waste summary, and you can qualify for that depending on how much waste you generate and what type of waste it is. But you have to do that evaluation, and typically that falls into the category of if you're a small quantity generator that generates a very small amount that year, or if you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator and excuse me, meaning that you generate less than 220 pounds of hazardous waste in a month, and you recycle all of your Class 1 non-hazardous waste. So there are ways that you can qualify for a no report required, but typically the amount of research and the amount of documentation involved in that is almost the same as if you had to do the report anyway. So the trick is to stay on top of your manifests as they come in, and you can do that tracking. So the data collection part of this, the tip that I have for this one is assemble a good team. And anytime you're doing an environmental reporting project, you set yourself up for success if you have a good team. And what I look for in team members with my clients, I look for one, the EHS manager tends to know the most about all this stuff, or they know who knows the most about the environmental issues. So I try to find someone that, or first the EHS manager, and then I look for a stratified team, meaning that I like to see a team that has a member from the line, a member from management, an EHS member, and even an upper management, at least those 4 levels, so that you can get different aspects for all of these, or a different set of eyes that see different things, rather than if you had everyone at the line level or everyone at the management level, you're only seeing it from one vantage point. So I like to see a stratified team. I like to see when we're assembling a team that people have been around a while, and that you anticipate that they're going to be around a while. It takes a lot of time to do these reports. And so if you have to retrain the same people over and over again what kind of information that you're looking for, then it makes it harder on yourself the next year. So look for a team that look for members that have either been around for a while or that you think are going to be around for a while, so you don't have to spend that time the next year training them up, or in future years. So that's the kind of stuff I like to see. I like to see responsible people, independent people, and people that are driven by deadlines, because like we talked about a second ago with all these deadlines, these are, and I didn't specifically say this, but I will now, these are hard deadlines. That means that if you don't meet this deadline, it's technically a violation. Now, you may not necessarily get caught, but it's technically a violation and you're out of compliance with that regulation. So the good thing is that most of these reports can be filed online now. The bad thing is that most of these reports can be filed online now. So if you're out of town, that's not really an excuse. Or if you're on PTO, that's not really an excuse. Whenever the deadline hits, that's when they're due. So keep that into consideration.
We have a question from Tom. Has the TCQ adopted the update EPA generator improvements rule amendments?
So that I don't know yet. without looking into it. No, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay. Well,
we'll get back to him. Thanks for the question, Tom. Okay, so the first thing that you want to look for is you need to accumulate all your waste manifests, and that's including hazardous waste and class 1 waste. And you need to keep those. We'd recommend you keep them in a binder, and then on top of that, you enter them either into a spreadsheet or you go ahead and manually enter them into the STEER's annual prep file. That either one of those will help you the next year whenever you're filling out the annual waste summary. So, and then another thing that either a lot of people don't realize you have to do or just don't always do is you're technically supposed to do an end of year inventory, and we'll go over the calculation and why that's important. But you're supposed to do an end of the year inventory so that you can make sure that your total quantity generated on the annual waste summary is the actual total quantity generated. So you'll do an inventory of what's in the back where your waste storage area is. And you also need to look at your satellite accumulation areas. Just as a reference more than anything, you'll need to look at your prior year's annual waste summary. The good thing is that if you filed it on STEER's, it's on STEER's. You can pull it up and figure out exactly what you reported for and make sure that you're at least consistent with what you're reporting. And then if you have new waste, you need to add those, obviously. And then, check with your vendors too. I know a lot of places, Safety Clean is one of them, and Valley Solvents, I believe, they will actually send you documentation for your annual waste summary if you ask for it. Some won't. I'm not going to say they all will, but some will, or they will at least send you an inventory of all the manifests and all that kind of stuff that you've sent, so that you can cross-reference it with what you have on site and make sure that you're capturing it all. So just as important as knowing what you have to report, it's also important and time saving to know what you don't have to report. So you don't have to report universal waste. You don't have to report used oil or used oil filters that are recycled. You don't have to report class 1 non-hazardous waste that is recycled. So if you have an oily water waste that half of it goes off for recycling and half of it goes off to the landfill, you need to figure out which part of it is being recycled, and you don't report on that part, but you report on the part that would go to the landfill. So there are also other ways that you can determine if you don't have to file an annual waste summary. One is if you're a non-industrial generator. So that's one of those things where you kind of have to document to prove that you're not type thing. And so we've included the reference there as to where you can go to make that determination. And then same thing, certain wastewaters aren't reportable. So the good thing there is that we'll give you a link to this instruction here in a minute, and you can go look at those, and they spell it out pretty well.
Real quick question, do you count paint in the AWS?
So paint and paint-related waste in Texas, if it is characterized as a universal waste, you wouldn't. If you're disposing of it on a waste code that has an H at the end, making it a hazardous waste, first off, you need to go to your vendor and say, hey, we're in Texas, and paint-related waste isn't considered a hazardous waste. It's a universal waste. And then you need to change your waste code so that it's a universal waste. So
go ahead.
So if you've already gotten rid of it under a hazardous waste code, I would report it. And if you in the future, once you get your universal waste code and all that kind of stuff, then no, you wouldn't have to report it.
Okay, and why not class 2 waste?
Just because that's the rule. I don't know why they make the differentiation between class 2. Class 2 is the most benign of the waste, if that's the correct way to term it. It's the least hazardous, and that's just the way it's always been. They just hazardous in class 1. So, okay, so this slide goes back to where we were talking about the end of the year inventory. So to the total quantity generated, which is one of the last things you'll fill in on the STEER's. Once you make your APF file, your annual prep file, if you choose to do it that way, I think it's nice and easy, and it does the math for you. If you do the APF file, you create an annual waste summary file, and then you have to go in and insert your total quantity generated. And that calculation is the amount shipped during the report year plus the amount site stored at the end of the year minus the amount stored on site at the end of the prior year. So that's why it's important to have those total quantity generated. To me, if I had my own facility, and I never have had my own facility, I would try to schedule as close to December 31st as I possibly could a shipment and get rid of as much of it as possible so that my inventory at the end of the year is next to nothing. I know that's not always possible. I know that a lot of places shut down for the year, and a lot of places you can't schedule it that far out, or you need it more frequently, whatever. But that would be my suggestion. But I know it's not always possible. But you are technically supposed to go and do an end of the year inventory, including your satellite accumulation areas and all that kind of stuff. So go back for just 1 second. Sorry, Lance. So yeah. So the total quantity generated, this is one of those things too that's kind of a little caveat. You don't include the portion in your total quantity generated for class 1 non-hazardous waste if it has already been recycled. But you do include the portion on the site that has been, or that is waiting to be recycled. So if you have a drum of used oil, and I guess, if you have a drum of class 1 non-hazardous waste and you know it's going to be recycled and it's stored in the back, that still counts as your total quantity generated, but it's not part of, because in theory, that could end up being shipped off somewhere that's not recycled, and you can't prove it until it's already been shipped. So there you go. Okay, so reporting tips: start early and make sure you have all your manifests. If I had my own facility, what I would do is I would first off, I would get my good team, and then I would, knowing how most EHS managers are, and they're overworked and they're working 16 hours a day and not sleeping nearly enough, I would have someone help me out with this, and I would have someone delegated to enter manifests into the APF file as soon as you get them, so that you don't have any surprises later. That serves two purposes. One, to make sure you're getting your designated facility signed copies, and then also to make sure that they're filling them in correctly. And then if you enter them on the fly as you're getting them, it's not, potentially a couple days worth of data entry at the end of the year. So that would be my biggest tip. Common mistakes are not reporting waste that are stored at the end on site at the end of the year, and then that goes to the total quantity does not always equal the total quantity shipped, and in most cases it probably doesn't in all reality. But again, I know most people either didn't know or don't do the annual end of the year inventory, but you're supposed to. So the main resource for this is the RG151. There's a link there, obviously, and that's a guidance. It's really good. It's not too long. I think it's 8 to 12 pages. It's not too bad. So it's a good place to go look. Tier 2s. So this is the one that we're spending most of our time on right now. A Tier 2 inventory report is it's for the use of fire departments and local emergency planning committees to either plan for catastrophes such as flooding, like we're having here in Dallas. Obviously, it's not anything to the Houston degree that we had earlier last year. But, if there was to be an emergency, they would need to know, okay, we need to evacuate people. Well, let's not evacuate them into a place where there's a facility that has chemicals that react with water. You don't want to get them away from that as much as possible. The firefighters use them as a reference. So say you have a fire at your facility, they need to know what kind of hazards they're getting themselves into. So what this does is it gives those emergency responders an idea of what kind of hazards are at your facility. So the first thing to do is to report, or to figure out whether or not you have to report. So you have to report if you have 10,000 pounds of a hazardous chemical, generally, or if you have or store 500 pounds or the threshold more than the threshold planning quantity, or 500 pounds, whichever is less, of an extremely hazardous substance. So those are a subset of chemicals that OSHA has decided are extremely hazardous, and they need to have extra precaution taken whenever handling them. So if you have either of those scenarios, then you have to report. And then if that chemical is on site for any one day during a report year, that means it qualifies. So a hazardous chemical, as defined by OSHA, is any element chemical element, mixture of elements, and or compounds that has a physical hazard or a health hazard. So basically, if there's an SDS for it, or if there's supposed to be an SDS for it, you have to do that evaluation. And that's the answer that I keep getting from the TCQ when I've called them. I've called with a couple different specific questions over the past couple of years, and their default answer is if there is an SDS for it, or if there's supposed to be one for it according to OSHA, then you have to do the evaluation for it. So this is a hairy slide. This is one that has a whole lot of words, even more than the others. And it's really not all that common that you have to use it. But with the mixture rule, basically what you're caring about here is if you have an EHS chemical in your facility or in your mixtures. So an EHS chemical, the good thing is generally they're in lower concentrations than most of the other chemicals in a mixture. But say you have a mixture that has hydrofluoric acid or something like that. Say you have a couple different mixtures. So rather than looking at each individual vat of hydrofluoric acid solution separately, you would have to do the calculation based on how much hydrofluoric acid is in site-wide. So if you had 10 different vats of it, you would have, and they're all at different solutions, you'd have to do the calculations to figure out how much hydrofluoric acid is in all of those vats at once. And then if you trip that 500 pounds in this case, because it's an EHS chemical, then you would have to report for that hydrofluoric acid. So reporting, common reporting exemptions. The good thing is I struggle with this a little bit. So there are a lot of things that are exempted in tier 2 reporting. For one, if the SDS clearly states that a chemical is not hazardous or is not reportable under sections 311, 312 of EPCRA, then you don't have to report it. Now, I will say that not all SDSs are created equal. So take into consideration the quality of the SDS. It tends to be getting better with the new HAZCOM standard and that kind of stuff. But we see a lot of SDSs that, you know, in the physical characteristics or the hazard characteristics, they say, oh, there's no hazard here. And then you go look at the physical characteristics and then it says, oh, yes, this is actually a flammable liquid. So you have to do your research too. You can't solely base it on the SDS. But it's a good place to start, obviously, with the SDS. Hazardous waste and radioactive waste. This is the one that I struggle with the most as a person. I've got a brother-in-law that's a firefighter, and if I were him and I had, you know, a bunch of hazardous waste on a facility and I'm responding to a fire, I would want to know that. But according to the rules of Tier 2, you don't have to report it. So that's another way you don't have to report. They're exempt. Any food additive, color additive, or drug that's regulated by FDA doesn't need to be reported. And any solid, I kind of look at these next two kind of together. Any solid or article, and an article is something that the function is defined by the shape. I look at that. My go-to example in my head when I think about articles is doorknobs. There's really not anything else you can do with a doorknob because it's a doorknob. And you know, there's only certain shapes that work for doorknobs. So that's how I define an article. So if it's a solid block of metal or an article, something like a doorknob, something like that, that's you've got around site, it doesn't necessarily need to be reported. So, and then go ahead. And then just as a reference there, and I think it's at the end of the slides too, but there are other exemptions out there too. So like if you have a bunch of chemicals that are readily available to general public, so say you go buy a bunch of Windex, that's intended, and you're using it for the intended purposes of Windex, then say you have 10,000 pounds of it, you wouldn't have to report that because it's available to general public. It's designed to be used by general public and that kind of stuff. So
somebody asked a question, have 10,000 pounds at one time or cumulative over the year?
At one time. Yeah, that's a good question. That's good. That's a good one. Otherwise you could get yourself in a whole lot of reporting trouble, not reporting trouble, but in a whole lot of time and effort that isn't required. So yeah, that's a good question. Key changes from the TCQ. There's quite a few here actually. And prior to 2 years ago, I believe, the Tier 2 program was regulated by the Texas Department of State Health Services. And since then, the TCQ has brought it on under their umbrella, and they're taking more time and consideration with it, I guess is maybe the way I look at it. They're looking into beefing up the tier 2 program, and that's why they're looking to report with steers. Right now we use the software tier 2 submit. It's old, it's clunky. It's actually one of my favorite softwares that we have to use for environmental reporting, because I know it well now and it doesn't change a whole lot, but there have been a couple of changes over the years. So like, for instance, this year, when you submit your tier 2 report, you need to have a registration number, a customer number, and a TXT2 number. Last year, they were letting you submit without having all three. This year you have to have it. Now they've set up an expedited tier 2 core data form that you can log into Steers and set up and get. And I believe there's still like a 2-day delay, I think is what they're saying, but it's much faster than having to fill out the whole core data form and that kind of stuff. So another change is that the TCQ is requesting more detail on storage locations. Before, you could go through and you can just say, oh, this is in the shop. And then you never really had to define where the shop was. But now they want you to do that. They want you to either now they're requiring a map. Is what we've been told at the trainings. So they're requiring a map, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can just be an aerial map, and say, even handwritten on there and scanned in and attached to it, handwrite on there, this is where we store our lead acid batteries. This is where we store our vats of hydrofluoric acid, as an example, and that kind of stuff. So that's one of the changes that's big this year. Another thing, they changed this last year, but I think it's worth mentioning again, is that the ammonium nitrate reporting timeline is 72 hours. Now, that comes out of the West Explosion event. That was the chemical that they determined that they were storing on site, and they hadn't done their tier 2 report update within 90 days. And so they changed that to 72 hours. So if you've got ammonium nitrate at large levels on your facility, you need to let them know ASAP.
Somebody's wanting to know what the TXT2 number is. Oh,
so the TXT2 number is just the state's reference number for a Texas Tier 2 TXT2. And, the rumor that I'm hearing is that they're actually eventually going to get away or do away with the TXT2 number. But for now, every facility has to get one. And that's where you log into Steers, the website, and there's a link here at the end, and it'll show you how to get your TXT2 number and that kind of stuff. So it's a Texas Tier 2 specific number that they could reference.
Okay, I think the listener was from Virginia, so he says that's not required for Virginia.
Right. Well, so I'm going to be real honest here. This is very Texas centric. So you'll have to check with Virginia on that. They may have something like that. Most of them have something similar to that, but not all of them do. So I know Oklahoma has, whenever you file your first tier 2, they send you a number. I think Louisiana is the same way. But I honestly don't know off the top of my head about Virginia.
Okay, great.
Okay, so again, there's the data collection part. And in all reality, that's what takes the most time with all of these reports, is that you have to take the time to gather up the information, get the SDSs, find out how much of this material is stored on your site. And that's why you need a good team. You need someone that you can say, okay, it's tier 2 season. Let's go ahead and get this done. And, you've got 10 days to get me an inventory of in all the different areas of the building or something like that. You just need to have a team that's reliable. So reporting tips, if you get when you get a TXT2 number, so say you're a business that has a large number of smaller entities within it, you can get one corporate number, and that way whenever you go to pay your fees, you can lump them together. So I know for manufacturing facilities, I believe you can pay for 2 facilities, I believe is the number. Assuming they have less than 25 chemicals, you can pay for 2 under one fee. And then if it's a non-manufacturing facility, like for instance, we do a lot of work with scrap metal yards, they're non-manufacturing facilities. We can technically, I believe, pay up to 7 on one filing fee. So it saves you a little bit of money on the hind end. So that's great. Right now, because they haven't finished up the Steers program yet, we are still submitting the tier 2 reports to the TCQ via email. They typically want just the T2S file. So whenever you log into whenever you download, Tier 2 Submit, what you get, at the end, after submitting all your information and running your validation check, you generate a report and it saves your file as a T2S file. And that's what you send to the TCEQ, and you email it to T2S data files, very original name, at tceq@texas.gov. So that's how we still have to submit with the TCEQ. Now, with the LEPCs and the local fire department, that's up to them on how they get it. The TCEQ has put together a list of LEPCs, and it's on their website, and I believe we have a link to it, and it shows who to contact, and most of the time it shows how they prefer it. Not every single county does that. But generally speaking, what we tend to do is we call the LEPCs for our clients, and we call the fire departments for our clients and say, okay, this is how we submitted it last year, and this is who we submitted it to last year. Is that still correct, or who should I send these reports, and how would you like them, type thing. There are very few. I can only think of one off the top of my head in West Texas, and I believe they're on the verge of changing too. Smith County, I believe, still prefers a paper copy. But generally speaking, if you email them, we typically default to emailing them the T2S file and a PDF of the file so that they have it in both ways and they don't have to think about it. So one of the things that I recommend, this is a personal documentation, a little nickism, if you will. Whenever you save your T2S file, save it with the TXT2 number at the front of it, so that when the TCEQ is looking for your file, they can sort it by that number, and there's no question as to who it is. Same thing whenever we send our emails, I'll label on my subject line, according to these three dots, I'll label it TXT2, yada, yada, yada. And then at the end, I will say TCEQ, and at the end, I'll say LEPC and fire department, and send 3 separate emails so that I know I'll get a separate read response for each of the 3. Now, I don't know whether or not the TCEQ is going to be sending individual delivery confirmations or not. Last year they didn't. They were working on that problem last time I talked to them, but that was probably a month ago. So I don't know whether or not we'll be able to get individual responses. So that's why I always request read receipts and delivery confirmation.
Real quick, has the hazardous category list been expanded to the 9 classes per federal amendments?
So the hazard classifications has expanded, and the good thing is if you have a good reputable SDS for your chemicals, it tends to go right along with the SDS. Now, when you log into Tier 2 Submit and you go to that chemical, what you'll see is there's a at least on my monitor, it's almost pink. There's a beige, and then there's a light pink tab, and whenever you select the hazards tab in Tier 2 Submit, what it'll do is it'll open up another tab, and it'll list off, I think there's probably 15 or 16 of them, and it lists off the individual hazards. So it's a lot more specific than it used to be. So whenever you go to update for this year, make sure that you're adding those hazard categories into your T2S file. So common mistakes that we see, and this is one that the TCEQ harps on. I think a couple of our girls went to the 8-hour class earlier this month, or maybe it was last month, and they said that almost 2 hours was spent on lead acid batteries, it seemed like. So, and a lot of that was, they presented the information, and then there were so many questions throughout the audience that it took almost 2 hours to get through it. But lead acid batteries are not an article, according to really any regulating body that does Tier 2s. I've looked at for different states, and everyone says you have to report lead acid batteries. And the reason for that is they have lead, which is a chemical, but then they also have sulfuric acid, which is a EHS chemical, which is reportable at 500 pounds. So commonly, these larger batteries are found in large forklifts, material handlers, stuff like that. And that's where you can really add up your sulfuric acid content. Now, if you have SDSs for specific batteries, you can use the actual sulfuric acid listed on the SDS. But if not, the TCEQ recommends and suggests, and it's probably a time saver more than it is anything. They suggest that you use 18% of the weight of the battery is sulfuric acid. More than likely, it's probably not going to be quite that high if you actually do the calculations and you have the electrolyte analysis, whatever. But if you don't want to do all that research and you just want to assume 18%, that's their recommendation, that's their guidance. And you can see that there's actually quite a bit of guidance on here. They've got their own lead acid batteries FAQs. There's a section for it in the instructions and that kind of stuff. So that's one of the big things that we deal with. And one of the things too that the TCEQ has changed since the days whenever it was Texas Department of State Health Services is that it used to be that if you reported for lead in the lead acid battery, so you had 10,000 pounds of lead and you had 500 pounds of sulfuric acid, you just reported sulfuric acid lead acid batteries with sulfuric acid. Now they want you to report two separate items: the lead acid batteries with sulfuric acid as an EHS component, and then they want you to report sulfuric acid as its own chemical and listed as an EHS as well. So that's one of the changes there.
What do you recommend if you have a chemical to report, but the Tier 2 submit does not have that CAS number?
If the CAS number is not in Tier 2 submit, I would manually fill in the name at in the second line where it asks the compound name or the chemical name, and then I would manually enter the CAS number. And if it won't let you do it there in the top line, if you've entered something differently, I would put it in the notes section. That's, I think, under the state tab, there's a notes or a clarification section. I'd put it in there too and just do a short little one sentence line saying this wasn't listed in the list of CAS numbers, but this is what it is.
And Tom made a statement, don't forget the lead in the batteries.
Right. Yeah. So the lead in the batteries is generally you'll meet the requirement for sulfuric acid before you do lead acid batteries because the reporting threshold's so low for the sulfuric acid. But you're absolutely right. Lead in sulfuric acid batteries is just as reportable as it's just as reportable as the sulfuric acid. One of the things here that I wanted to touch base with, and we learned during the training, is that there used to be a bug in the Tier 2 submit software, and they didn't catch it until midway through January. So if you downloaded Tier 2 submit 2017 in the beginning of January, first things first, export your T2S files that you've been working on, and make sure that you have access to them and they're on your hard drive or your server or stuff like that. And then also uninstall the program and then re-download it. And it's my understanding that no matter what you did, it wouldn't let you pass the validation check. So so that's why they're having you re-download it. So again, here's a list of the resources. The good thing is, like I said, TCEQ's done a lot of the research for you as far as the LEPCs and the Texas fire departments. If the fire department is for a smaller area, it may not be on there, but a quick Google search generally will get you where you want to go. Okay, so we are going way long, so I'm going to pick it up. Sorry about that. We'll cover everything, but it may just be quick. So the next deadline is March 31st after you get through Tier 2 and annual waste summaries. So the next one is your benchmark and DMR reportings for stormwater, and then the area emissions inventory report. We'll tackle hey, go back.
Sorry.
We're not going to go that fast.
I thought you were wanted me to go back.
Sorry. Sorry, that's my fault. I was pointing at the slides. So, so do you have to report if you have a current Texas MSGP stormwater permit, and you have sector-specific benchmark requirements, or you have sector-specific numeric effluent limits, then you'll need to report. And then all facilities have the annual metals DMR requirement, unless you have a hazardous metals monitoring waiver. And if that's the case, that should be filed with your binder and all that kind of stuff. But generally, if you have a sampling requirement, then you have a reporting requirement. So for benchmarks, the benchmarks, remember, are the ones that are semi-annual generally. They're semi-annual. I guess they are semi-annual. And it's for two different periods, one from January to June and one from July to December. And what you do with those numbers is you get a site-wide average for January to June, you get a site-wide average for June or July to December, and you compare that average to the benchmark values. Now, remember, exceeding a benchmark value is not a violation of the permit. What exceeding a benchmark value does is that triggers you to do an investigation or figure out why you're not meeting that benchmark value, so that you can go back and figure out and try to drop that number and to get closer to the benchmark value. Even if you didn't get a sample for benchmarks, you still have to file the form with the state. And this is one of benchmark and DMRs at this point are still snail mailed in. It's the last one of the group that you still have to snail mail stuff in. So even if you don't have a sample, you have to submit a report saying no discharge or we weren't able to sample, and you have to give an explanation. So in West Texas, I know a lot of places didn't get samples the second half of the year because they had no rain and from September 3rd or whatever on to the end of the year in parts of in West Texas.
Can I go now?
There we go. Yeah,
okay.
You can go now.
Thank you.
I won't bite your head off. The next thing is the discharge monitoring report. Annual metals discharge monitoring reports you have to submit to the TCEQ only if there's a violation of one or more of the limits. Otherwise, you just retain it with the SWIP. So that's where it gets a little bit hairy, because starting September of this year, you're going to have to submit net DMR reports. And so when that happens, I guess there will be a little bit of guidance. In my mind, you fill out the report in net DMR and then just file it, and then print it off and keep it in your binder. But I'm guessing they'll give us a little bit of guidance, or I can look further into that and then follow up if we have questions on it. But annual sector specific DMRs, one thing to note there, if you have annual sector specific ones, that you have your own DMR, the actual form. So you need to go back to the permit or go to the TCEQ's website and download that form so you can submit it. And then those need to be submitted by March 31st of the year. So, and then just as a reference, those are the sectors that have the sector specific DMRs. Data collection, assembling a good team isn't as crucial on this one, but you'll see in a minute why it's nice to have a team to help you with all this. You'll need to get your numeric effluent lab reports. You'll need to get your benchmark lab reports. And generally, we always suggest to our clients that if they have benchmark requirements and they have annual hazardous metals requirements, the first sample that they get for the year, they run for both. That way, they know they have the annual metals sample out of the way, and they'll have one of their two benchmark monitoring requirements out of the way as well. So, and then dig up your COCs, your chains of custodies, that kind of stuff that might have any sort of information on your paperwork for your analysis. We put all of our client stuff into an ongoing spreadsheet, and we do it outfall by outfall, site by site, and all that kind of stuff, so that if you do it that way, these benchmark and DMR calculations are really pretty easy. So, reporting tips, make sure that you keep the benchmark or the completed benchmark and DMRs on site for 3 years. They need to be signed. I know a lot of times, you send something to a client or you send something to your boss in PDF and say, hey, please sign this. And then it kind of goes into a black hole. But in an ideal world, those would be signed, and they're supposed to be signed and kept at the binder for 3 years. Benchmark results are averaged across all outfalls on the form, and same thing with DMRs. So you don't look at it and you don't submit a benchmark for each outfall. You submit it for one for the site. And then we talked about this earlier, but because of the flooding and the hurricane relief efforts, net DMR is not quite ready, but that they've at least on their website, they say it should be ready by September 2018. So go ahead, and if you want to, you can sign up for net DMR now. That way we don't have to worry about it, but you won't be able to submit information until after September of this year. So this is why you need a good team, so that this isn't you. It's always nice to have someone that you can pawn this off on so they can get sopping wet while you're in your office, nice and cozy and that kind of stuff. But common mistakes that we see, particularly with mercury and sometimes with other metals, the units are different. So say they report in micrograms per liter versus milligrams per liter. So when that's the case, you need to do the conversion. And then The next thing is to read the instruction reports. I know, Lance, I'm hurrying. The next thing is to read the instructions. These are about as simple as they can get. Each one of the reports has its own thing. Now, I will admit, and a good catch by my cohort in crime, Jennifer, she caught that the the DMR instructions actually still say to submit one for each outfall, but it's not correct. It's just one for each site. So we'll send you the links, or the links will be at the end of the slideshow here in a second, and you can refer to those. They have good tips on how to handle a number of different instances in your reporting. And there they are. Okay, so the air emissions inventory report, again, this is one of those, not as many of our clients have to do it. It's not my strong point, so I'm going to be real 100,000 foot level on this stuff and really just kind of present the information as it is. You'll notice in the teaser for this, initially it was listed as Lori Siegelman, and she's not here. She got tickets to the Elton John concert, so she's going to that. And then Heather got called to Hereford. So those are our two air permitting people that were up here that were going to be able to help me, but they both got called to work. So like I said, this is real honest. This isn't my strong point, but we'll go over the information just so you have it.
Just so you know, if I had tickets to Elton John, I would dump you too. So.
Yeah, whenever she told me she got them, I was like, okay, so I guess you won't be there. And I was like, that's fine. I'd go too. That's right.
She didn't invite us though. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the invite, Lori. So do you have to report if you're a major facility or you're major stationary source? According to 30 TAC 116.12, you have to report. If your site is located in an ozone non-attainment area emitting a minimum of 10 tons per year of VOCs, 25 tons per year of NOx, or 100 tons per year of any other contaminant subject to the ambient air quality standards, national ambient air quality standards, then you have to report. If you emit half a ton of year per lead, see, this is why I don't understand, or my brain isn't good with air permitting, because if you emit half a ton of lead, that's a lot of lead just to be coming out in the air. So my brain doesn't think that way. So
we can skip the next slides and we can do an air emissions webinar at another time.
Let's get them the information,
right.
and then we'll go through that. And yes, if you have questions on this, we'll definitely recruit Lori or Jennifer or Heather or Vanessa,
or somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, anyone besides me.
Okay, just kidding.
Yeah. So what you want to start to do, and this one and TRI actually are the two that take the longest time to do. So you'll want to accumulate stack test data or monitoring data. You want to collect production, chemical usage. A lot of times an air permit is based on annual throughput. So you want to know what that's through. In theory, these calculations for the air emissions inventory would be pretty straightforward, because technically you're supposed to be using the same calculations that you used in your air permit application, and you would just modify them based on the year. But it's not always as easy as it sounds. Yes, the calculation should be the same, but getting your hand on the same information year after year after year is always difficult. You'll want to know what applicable equipment that you have, where your pollution control devices are, where they emit to, potential emission factors. Generally, that's something like the AP42 that has, there's an emission factor for pretty much everything in the AP42, and then associated calculations. If you have a way that you estimate fugitive emissions, that's a good thing to go ahead and dig up and have readily accessible. SDS's vendor data is a good thing to have. Sometimes a vendor will have a similar piece of equipment doing the exact same thing, and you can use process knowledge and that kind of stuff to do your emissions inventories as well. And then obviously it always helps to have the previous year's report, so that you can refer back to what in the world you did 12 months ago and why you made this assumption and that kind of stuff. Reporting tips. I'm sorry. Oh, he's shaking his head. Okay. Reporting tips and common mistakes. So the EI structure, before you get going on your initial EI, and some of this, y'all may have already passed this, but as you're doing your initial EI, let's make sure that you have your facility ID numbers, your control numbers, and your emission point numbers all in the right place. So you can have two control measures for one booth or one facility ID, or you can have emission points multiple emission points for a facility ID, but each one of those processes that generate that emission or that air emission has one FIN or facility ID number. So it's okay whenever you set it up in steers. You can change, you can modify a structure in steers, but you can't remove a structure in steers. And then the naming convention, once you've started going with what you pick as your naming convention, it's very hard and typically cannot change the designators. Collective sources. TCQ encourages grouping of similar small emission sources. So if you have a plethora of baths that have oil, or they're like an oil oil evaporators, so you've got something like that are covered by an air permit, then if you've got a handful of them, then you could group those together as long as the machinery is the same and roughly the same amounts going through them and stuff like that. Annual emissions for source include routine, authorized operations. Sorry, I merged those two words there. And then maintenance, startup, and shutdown procedures. Now, this doesn't include emission events or non-authorized maintenance, startup, and shutdowns. Those will come in later. Reporting tips, speciating your emissions based on where you are. You have certain requirements to speciate your chemicals. So some places it's okay to say I have VOCs at this many tons per year, HAPs at this many tons a year. But depending on where you are and the type of permit you have, you may have to speciate that out to know exactly which VOCs you have and that kind of information. Confidential information. This is a big one. A lot of you guys have technology or information on your site that's very confidential, and or you may be in a sensitive area and you don't want this necessarily being advertised to the whole entire world. So when you send all of your confidential information, you actually do that via certified mail, one to prove that it got there and it didn't end up in someone else's hands, and then also to prove that it got there. And then don't submit it as a documentation or a appendix or attachment to steers or via email. What they want you to do is put it in confident or certified mail and label each page or each disc, whichever one it is, as confidential, so that they know that it's something that they can't share. So this is one of those things, the ozone seasoned emissions. You'll see here that's the 100 longitude line, and anything that's to the east of that and El Paso, so you get all the big towns covered. So El Paso and all the big towns east of that blue line there, you have to do this calculation for your ozone seasonal formula. And basically that's the average ozone rate equals your routine emission rate of the contaminant emitted over 153 days, and that's generally the hottest time of the year where we have the highest ozone problems. Okay, so thanks for cleaning this slide up, Jennifer. This is actually a real helpful and for me in presenting it, but I think it will help everyone too. So a complete EI or an emission inventory has a SEER submission, sample calculations, summary test results for stack test data, summary relative accuracy test audits for your continual emission monitoring or your predictive emission monitoring systems, making sure that they're working correctly, and then your signed certification statement. All of those get submitted online via steers. Oh, sorry, Siri was chiming in. And then also, but what you have to report earlier, like I said earlier, is the confidential information. You report that hard copy and you send it certified mail.
Okay. So Nick, we have 5 more minutes. So we got
this.
Okay, go.
Okay, we got this. 5 minutes. All right.
I will cut
you off. We
have
6 minutes by my watch. Okay. So do you have to report a tier 2, a TRI report? Oh, dang, this is going to take a minute to explain.
Go.
The tier 2, the TRI report has, it's similar to the tier 2 report, but instead of looking at what you have present on your site at any given time, it looks for an annual throughput or it looks at how much you manufacture, you process, or you otherwise use at a facility. So there's 3 different criteria you have to meet to qualify for a TRI report. First, your NAICS code has to be listed. If you check this list and your NAICS code isn't listed on there, there's a good chance you don't have to report. First, and then secondly, you have to have the equivalent of 10 full-time employees for the facility. And I say for because this includes offsite personnel that supports that facility. So say you've got a rail car transloading area that one person works at all year long, but there's people back at corporate that are constantly scheduling loads, all that kind of stuff. Those hours count as the 10 full-time employee hours. So you have to do that calculation to make sure if you make sure you are above or below, depending on which way you think you are, to 20,000 hours. And then you have to manufacture, process, or otherwise use, we'll abbreviate that MPOU, a TRI reportable quantity. The threshold for manufacturing and processing is 25,000 pounds. And then the typical threshold for otherwise used is 10,000 pounds. And there's definitions for those. It's important to know those definitions. And I think we go over that in a minute, but if not, that's something that we can definitely go over. Now, there is a subclass of chemicals, and I'm going quick, a persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic class of chemicals that the reporting threshold is either 10 or 100 pounds. Unfortunately, lead's one of those. So if you have a bunch of lead solders, there's a good chance you're going to have to do that, to report that kind of material. So this is a graphic showing what we just went over. So I'll brush over that real fast and get on to the next one so we can get to the information. So unlike the Tier 2 report, the TRI report is 2 distinct steps. You have to determine whether or not you meet the threshold. So if you're exceeding the 25,000 pounds of manufacturing or processing of the chemical, or the 10,000 pounds of or otherwise use. And if you meet those distinctions and you meet those criteria, then you have to complete the Form R. And that's where you track where all of your releases to the environment go. That's tracking your air emissions, that's tracking your wastewater emissions, stormwater, where you send your recycling off, where you send your waste off to, and all that kind of stuff. So there's 2 different steps. First, you have to determine if you meet the threshold, and then once you meet that threshold, then you have to do the evaluation on your releases. The TRI process, okay, this is another summary slide. A good one to know, but in the sake of time, we'll skip over it. You'll get the slides here in a minute, or in a day or two. Data collection, this is the one that at least I have the hardest time with, and maybe I'm not mean enough, I don't know. But there's a lot of times where towards the end of the TRI reporting season, I basically have to go sit at people's offices and say, okay, I'm not leaving until you get me this information or tell me who to go talk to so we can meet the deadline. But start early, have a good team, start early type thing. So what you're wanting to do for step 1 is you get all your SDSs, your MSDSs, and vendor data so you have an idea of what chemicals you have on site and at what rate you're using them. If you've used 25,000 pounds of it. Analytical reporting data, you'll want to know. And then, to me, a good person to have on this team is someone in procurement or purchasing, because they see the chemicals that you're using on a routine basis. And if they know that you're looking for this, they can start, tracking that a little bit differently. Each system's different, and that's the hard part. Each company tracks their purchases different and their emissions different. So you just kind of have to mold the spreadsheets and the reports to each client, but it's definitely possible. Release reporting, main thing you'll want to track here is manifest and other shipping documentation. You get your stormwater reports out, your DMRs, your benchmark monitoring reports. If you have an EI, that's a good thing to have. Some facilities don't have to do an air emissions inventory, so they don't have that. But typically, if you've got an air permit, there will be some sort of emission, and you can do that. Now, one thing that the EPA doesn't require you to do is it doesn't require you to take a sample. Now, if you have a sample available for stormwater, then you're supposed to use it. Or if you have a sample for waste characterization, you're supposed to use it. But if you don't have an analytical result or something like that for it, you can use process knowledge, that kind of stuff, to determine the approximate quantity of the material. Reporting tips, again, there's unfortunately this is kind of a long one, the TRI reporting the instructions. It's kind of a long one, but again, familiarize yourself with facility, what it means, because if you've got two facilities that are separated by a road, it counts as one facility, or it can count as one facility, that kind of stuff. Manufacture, process, and otherwise used, that's a good another definition to know. Again, that will be linked up there. But the type of exemptions that you have, there's a handful of them. There's a de minimis exemption, which basically says if the chemical is less than either 1% or 0.1%, depending on the chemical, then you don't have to report it. Now, the PBT chemicals don't have a de minimis value. So unfortunately, if there's lead in anything except for your steel, then that lead's probably going to be reportable if you use any quantity of it. An article exemption, again, if you've got stuff that you bring in a bunch of doorknobs and you attach them to a door and you don't do anything to that doorknob other than attach it to the door, that article is exempt and you don't have to report on it. Laboratory chemicals aren't typically reportable. Motor vehicle maintenance, janitorial supplies, and structural components aren't reportable either. And then there are a handful of sectors like coal mining and metal mining that have very good lobbyists, and they have a good set of exemptions. And now those get a little bit hairy. Those documentations get a lot longer, but it's definitely worth the read if you're in the coal mining or the metal mining industry. Reporting mistakes. Document. This is probably the one that we do the most documentation on. I know I've had new EHS managers come onto a site and say, okay, well, where's last year's TRI? And I'll send them. I'll have to send them either the share file link because it's such a large file, or I'll just mail them then, and then they get it and they're like, why is this 200 pages type thing? But it's because we document everything. So you have to, and if you don't have to file a tier 2 or a TRI report, something like that, it's just as important to document that you don't have to require or to report as it is to do the report itself. So we use the designated term or the designated nomenclature for RY 2017. So this year, when we're 2018, we're working on RY 2017 reports, meaning these are the reports that are based on 2017 information. If you just call it 2017 TRI report, you don't know if that was the report based on 2017 data, and you don't know if it's the report that you filed in 2017. So that's why we use the RY nomenclature. Get good records to ensure consistency from year to year. Again, that goes back to your team too. So if you can accumulate and keep a team together that's going to be there a while, it gets easier and easier as you're doing it. Don't reinvent the wheel. Inside your spreadsheets, inside your documentation, leave little reminders for yourself. I got this information from such and such. I got this information. Here's the new vendor for this, that kind of stuff. So keep little Easter eggs in your spreadsheets for you. Keep records of all calculations. Technically, you're required to have these on site for 3 years, but the EPA can ask for up to 5 years. So we always recommend you keep up to 5 years of these reports. And then another big thing to know the difference between is not applicable and zero. So when you're doing the Form R, it will ask you, do you have any wastewater releases? And you either have to answer with a number, a zero, or a not applicable. If you don't have any drains and it's not possible for you to discharge to a POTW, then you don't have any releases of wastewater to a POTW because it's not possible. But if you have drains and you don't think anything's going down there, but you can't prove it, then it's better to report as a zero if you don't have any way of measuring it. Again, use range code. As far as reporting tips, use range codes as much as possible. Now, sometimes they can hurt you. So say you have a release of 102 pounds, 151 pounds or whatever, but the range code is 151 to 500 pounds, or maybe it's 250, I forget. Whatever that range code is, if you have, on the low end and you report the range code, what that'll do whenever it present your emissions for the year, it will get 375. It'll take that median. So it's overestimating your emissions. So be careful when you use range codes, but they're also very valuable to use because, that allows a little bit of wiggle room in your calculations. You can only be as accurate as your basis of estimate. So the more information you have, the better. And then for non-PBTs or persistent bioaccumulative or toxic chemicals, you're supposed to round to 2 significant digits. And then there's a slew of resources here for you. And this one's real short. I know I'm 4 minutes over. I'm sorry, Lance.
You're good.
Okay. The questions for the annual progress reports is if you have a pollution prevention plan, which in Texas, I guess in general, if you're a large quantity generator of hazardous waste, or you're a TRI 4MAR reporter, you're supposed to have a pollution prevention plan. And what that does is it outlines a strategy for your company to reduce emissions and figure out ways to not have to emit as many of these hazardous chemicals. So you'll look at it at a chemical by chemical basis, and typically it looks at your hazardous waste and your TRI reportable chemicals, and you find projects, or you think of projects that you can do in the next 5 years, and you don't have to do them all, but you evaluate them, say, hey, can we use smaller blocks of lead to make these parts instead of the large ones, and then you have less lead. So you'll want to look at your project metrics that you've been using for tracking your pollution prevention progress. You'll look at 4MAR reports and your annual waste summaries. So the good thing about this one is most of the work's already done at this point. This is another July 1st deadline, so it teams up with TRI very well. But you've already done the release information, and you've already done the annual waste summary for the beginning of the year. So you just have to look at those two pieces of data and interpolate or extrapolate one or the other, where your waste is going and have you had a reduction or have you not. Next. Okay, so see, short and sweet, like a Band-Aid. This is one of the things that people don't always do, and some people don't put a lot of credence into the APR because their production changes so much from year to year. So from year to year, you can have a 15 or a 25% swing in production for the year. And with that being said, you can also have a swing in production of wastes for the year. So if you had a 10% increase in production and a 10% increase in waste for the year, you haven't really had an increase in waste. It's just in relation to your production. That being said, if you increase by 15% and your waste drops 10%, you've got a 25% reduction there. So it's good to take that into consideration. It's not just a gross measurement, it's a ratio. There's some documents. Again, the tips are don't be late, like I am on this. Know your date. Start early. I put calendar entries on my calendar all throughout this period saying, hey, have you started this? Hey, have you started this? Hey, have you started this? Do you have to report? Know when you have to report. Assemble a good team. It'll make your life so much easier if you have a nice, reliable team. Read the instructions. There's a lot of guidance out there. We tried to link as many of them as we possibly could that are worthwhile, and then document. So that's, if you have to report, document. If you don't have to report, you have to document that you don't have to report. So you have to do the work in one way or another. So this is a little bit about W&M. Do you want to go over this, Lance?
No, I just want to. There should be another dot on a star in our new office in Lubbock.
Yeah, we have. Actually, it's technically in Lubbock, but he spends most of his time in Hereford, so we can have a big dot over both of those cities. So again, feel free to contact me. If I don't know the answer, I will find someone here that does know the answer, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we possibly can. So thanks for sitting in. I appreciate it. I'm sorry I kept you 8 minutes late.
Good. No, you're good.
Lance
Nick,
is gonna.
Thank you for joining us and some great information. And I will be getting the recordings and these very informative slides on the website probably tomorrow afternoon, and I will send you an email with the link. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next time on reductive dechlorination of groundwater. Did I say that right?
That sounds like a Jim Flory.
It was a Jim Flory. So it's going to be great, and I will have a confused look on my face most of the time. So thanks, guys. Enjoy your day.
All right. Thanks so much.